I love Richard Vague's video, and I do it. And Megan, Ellen, I guess what I'm going into, because I am so intrigued with what science can deliver for society. We called this session, I think, what do we call it? To the moon and back. It sounds so anachronistic. It should be to Mars and back, right, Ellen?
Exactly.
For those of you who don't know, the scientific expertise sitting on this stage is profound. When you add the gender issue, which I kind of hate doing because I think, you're just the most profound scientist I know. Ellen was the former chief scientist at NASA, now heads the National Air and Space Museum, and she's a Mars wonk and a Mars obsessive. Megan, who's the chief technology officer, has had every cool job in both the private sector and public sector in technology, except the ones that Ellen has had. So, I mean, you're a remarkable pair. But I guess I want to ask you, as we're thinking about a more perfect union and what it takes and where we could go, what is the state of science today, Megan?
Yeah, I think both of us speak to that. I think there's extraordinary discoveries, there's extraordinary tools. The fact that computation is now integrated into science, data science with more classic science, it's a really exciting time. Also, there's a lot of people that are systemically left out. And so we have an incredible opportunity to think more like apprentice journey mastery of how we welcome people in and share more what the possibilities, what's starting to work, what's out there, and almost community organized innovation and really broaden the participation. A big part of broadening participation is not just who is doing it, but what are they working on? So I'll give you an example. I just came from the Sundance Film Festival where there's some wonderful films. One is called Coded Bias, about algorithmic bias, because one group is writing all the algorithms and not paying attention to the breadth, like face recognition is very racist and sexist and ageist. There's a film there about Tesla. And I love Tesla, I'm from Buffalo. He lit Buffalo with Niagara Falls, right? But a lot of people don't know that at the Chicago World's Fair that we love Edison and Tesla and the fighting, we don't know two other stories. One story is the woman who invented the dishwasher, now the company KitchenAid, Josephine Cochrane, you never heard of her. And the other story, the reason why. A paper written by Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, and others, the reason why the colored American is not in the Columbian exhibition is the name of this paper from the 1800s, 1892. These people in this paper list the African American pavilion that would have been in the Columbian exhibition, like pages of patent holders, sculptors, architects, philosophers, poets, whatever, 25 years after slavery ends, and the accomplishment, I want to make it in VR so we all can see it. So I think about Silicon Valley and how racist and sexist it's being on around inclusion. And this is not a pipeline problem. Let's go back 100 years and notice who got left out.
Right.
We celebrated Tesla and Edison.
Before I jump to Ellen on
out
this,
Ida.
you talk about the racist, sexist behavior of Silicon Valley. You were one of the biggest players in Silicon Valley. Why aren't they listening to you and getting it right?
I think they're trying. It's one of these things where this is hundreds of years of disastrous behavior. And it's not any individual, it's systemic. And it's really an opportunity to raise the priority. I loved the piece we just watched. Americans are so talented everywhere, everybody in the world. Humans are talented. Shift 7 means and, it also means shift to 7 billion colleagues. But we went on a Tech Jobs tour all over this country and found genius. I got the Wakanda layer, like all the people in Idaho and Appalachia and Silicon Valley who are doing amazing things all around the world, in Ghana, in France. There's talent everywhere, and what's happening is the cultural binding, the bro-utopia, the who looks right, who do we see on screen? I have a Raspberry Pi in my pocket. It's just a chipboard, right? It's the same as the thing. We learn to use this, but we don't learn to play with this in second grade. We learn to read and write, but we don't learn to write STEM. And Ellen, you have so much of this, but how do we scrub everyone in a kind way to apprentice journey mastery themselves in the way we've done for the great history of the country with some people? How about everybody? How about starting in second grade with this? The McDowell County, we talked about that.
Sure.
The Muskogee Creek tribe of Oklahoma does robotics and Head Start, right? So let's do that.
Right. Sounds great.
So we have things on that, and we can talk
I'm
more
in.
about that.
Ellen, I think Air and Space Museum is the most visited museum in the country,
US.
in the United
Yeah,
States,
it's
right?
amazing.
So how do you translate that strength and magnetism of what you're now running into an inclusive appreciation for science and tech and the next generation of opportunity? A lot of people are scared of technology. A lot of people are scared of what AI will bring. A lot of people have been displaced by technology in the past. How do you see your role smoothing out those transitions?
Well, I think part of it is how do you give people a feeling that they have agency in their own future? And I think, again, also loved that video we just saw. And I think people are increasingly feeling like the future is something that's happening to them rather than something that they have agency in, because a lot of people have been excluded. So when we think about the things, like we're in this really on the verge of such amazing things. I mean, I honestly think we're going to have urban aerial mobility in the next decade, flying cars, more commonly known. You know, we're really looking at how space is expanding. We're going from government astronauts to private astronauts. Private companies, is low Earth orbit in the moon? Are they potentially new economic development zones? You know, we're actually, I think in the next 20 years, actually going to see someone step foot on Mars. We're discovering thousands of planets constantly. We're looking beyond all this exciting, wonderful stuff going on. But then you look at who's excluded, who's not participating. And to me, we're just leaving talent on the table. And so at the Air and Space Museum, we're really thinking about how do we engage the next generation of innovators and explorers to make science, technology, engineering, math look more like our population, because it doesn't right now. We have failed. And so whose stories are we telling? Are we finding those stories that haven't been told? I saw the play Silent Sky last night about Henrietta Leavitt, the famous astronomer who worked at the Astrophysical Observatory in Harvard and helped us understand how to measure distance in the universe. None of us have ever heard of her. Okay, there are so many stories like that out there, like we learned with Katherine Johnson that Megan and I worked on together. So I just think that our role is to make sure we're telling the stories of people who were there all along, but whose stories were never told. And then it's to really think about, how do we get people of color engaged? How do we get white women engaged to say, STEM is for you. These are the jobs of the future. This is the economic growth of the future. You need to be involved. And so are we giving all kids in our museum access to Raspberry Pis? And that's something we're really thinking about. How do we reach communities we have not been reaching?
You both have dealt with Congress a lot, and we've had, I think, some outstanding, both Republican and Democratic members of Congress, but not every member of Congress is outstanding. And
No comment.
what's that?
No comment.
Yeah, and both of you have to deal with these folks. And when I ask about the state of science, those of us who look at, you know, debates on climate change, climate science, when you look at issues like going to Mars, or you look at the question of who are the players and also the hidden voices and hidden players in our history, there's a very uneven literacy in Congress, in my view, in this. Am I wrong? And I guess what should we be worried about that? Because, you know, I just, you know, I feel like this climate stuff right now, I can't believe we're continuing to have fights about, you know, a basic, not, you know, before you even talk about whether there's something that should be done about, you know, climate change, for instance. But that's also part of the science picture. Are you worried that we have people who don't respect science making decisions?
Well, I think for one hand, you look at some things. I think there's broad bipartisan support for investment in technology. I think there's broad bipartisan support. We've had huge bipartisan support to rebuild the Air and Space Museum. So I think there's recognition by most of the importance of investing in STEM, investing in the future. I have actually found the messages that we were just talking about to really resonate across party lines. I think climate is one place where this really breaks down. I find it terrifying, the lack of progress we've made. And I do really worry about how do you stop arguing about whether climate change is happening, because it's really obvious the data are beyond debate, and how do you move to the next level of actually making meaningful progress on reducing carbon emissions and getting more serious about resilience.
What's your favorite exhibit in the museum?
Oh, you know, I get asked that all the time. I have 3 children, and
And
they're
you don't have
constantly
an
trying
answer?
to get to get me to say which is my favorite child, and I feel like that about the museum. You know, I love the SR-71, you know, designed by the Skunk Works. Kelly Johnson was this amazing designer. It's, to me, one of those things that you look at, it's just the epitome of great design and amazing performance, this height of
Megan,
technology.
what you're doing, thank you, Megan, what you're doing with Shift 7 is so interesting to me, and the way you look at entrepreneurship, which I sort of feel is another area under siege, or, you know, people aren't looking at the environment which that's happening. You're trying to move the needles in that. What do you want to tell our audience, those watching online, about what we need to get done right in the ecosystem to get, you know, more Shift 7-like, you know, stuff happening?
Yeah, we only work in partnerships. Like I said, Shift 7 means and, if you type it. It's kind of a mindset, and there's two parts of our focus. One we call Scout and Scale. You're taking community organizing principles and innovation principles. So for example, the venture capitalists don't make SpaceX or Amazon or Facebook, any of these things, right? You find these entrepreneurs and you help them. But if you look at the breadth of entrepreneurs like Clara Barton or Gandhi or George Washington Carver, inclusive of Edison, you know, if we can broaden who we're helping. So we often, when we see a challenge, climate challenge, other challenge, we're like, okay, this is hard. We try to interrogate enough of it, but we actually try to team up to like, look, I wonder who's already fixing this. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And come together. You can't usually, for example, if you found, you know, one of the ones we found in office when we were working with President Obama on criminal justice reform, Miami went from 7,000 people in prison to 4,900 closed to jail and saved $12 million. How'd you do that? And they had focused on helping people who had substance abuse and mental health challenges. And they helped the police and the 911 have another place to go, which was a stabilization unit in the hospital. And so suddenly, thousands of people ended up not arrested and into programs. And so they were able to reduce the jail population. Now, Miami's busy being Miami. They can't be Wichita or South Bend or whatever. So how do you more rapidly share? So how do you build communities of practice? How do you not just make PDF best practices, but like, you know, meetups and start moving that? So we were doing that. We did that with Tech Hire. So you're using community organizing principles. Tech Hire is, so many Americans will learn coding and computer science from boot camps, a couple months now. You know, this kind of stuff. There's thousands, millions of jobs for us. Most cities like Memphis, 45,000 young people out of school and out of work, suffering. And FedEx and AutoZone starving, you know? And so Mecca is there bridging with Code Crew. So what we did is try to find Mecca or Keegan, who's just opening a tech center in the Mississippi Delta, in the tiny town of Water Valley, above the grocery store, where all the kids who didn't go to college, who are hanging out, they could go work at McDonald's or whatever, but instead they go to coding boot camp. He's on his 4th class. You know, dozens of kids are going into the Mississippi tech sector in not 20K a year, but 80K a year job, and they don't want to move to Silicon Valley. They love Mississippi. So all around our country, from Idaho and the Innovation Collective out there, Erica in Oklahoma with her work with women coming out of prison, all Americans are getting it done, but nobody knows. And so this part of our work, Scout and Scale, is find who's already fixing and come up underneath them the way any innovator, and also don't be so biased to a set of things, like is tech just for robotics and precision medicine? No, it's for justice and equality. So find innovators of all types, community organize together and support them, because you look for who, not what. And the second part of things we work a lot on are media and media bias. How are the things like the stories we were just talking about? Like one of my favorite exhibits is the Wright brothers, which is really the family right. And so we did a thing with Amy Poehler Smart Girls, Shift 7 team, and the female quotient. We posted 20 stories of extraordinary accomplishments by women for the first 20 days of this decade. And so they're up, and one of them is Susan Wright. Wow. You never knew that Wilbur and Orville's mother was a mechanical genius. Taught her boys and daughter design thinking. And that it's this family right that had a bicycle shop, because that was kind of the right design center to get into the air, really did this together, and
I
that their
have to admit,
sister
I've
was
never
involved.
heard of Susan Wright.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel ashamed.
Well, no, you shouldn't feel ashamed, but you should feel motivated, because that's the thing. We don't have to blame ourselves.
Right.
We grew up in this very biased thing, right? But we have to notice and then start telling the stories equally and let them stand. Bessie Coleman. And so what we did with these 20 women, they should all be household names. This group of women in Michigan who saved us from whooping cough with like 3K across years, just doing cough plates and community organizing and just extraordinary, right?
Bessie Coleman was the first African-American woman to get a pilot's license. She had to go to France to get it. And she did. She left Chicago at the age of 26. And when she came back to the US and became a barnstorming pilot, she refused to fly at races that were, at barnstorming exhibits that were segregated. She's an amazing woman.
Incredible. Native American, African American women.
In a moment, we're going to talk about with someone I totally admire about structural racism and undoing that. I want to ask you about structural sexism that you've had to deal with. Or have you not experienced structural sexism? Like, what's that? I mean, explain to people who haven't walked in your shoes what you either had to deal with, overcome, you know, and you know, I almost, to play off Ibram Kendi's book, How to Become an Anti-Racist, how do you become an anti-sexist?
Yeah.
I think you have to look at everything. I mean, Megan and I were just talking about the issue of spacesuit design, right? Everybody hugely celebrated the fact that you finally had these two women do a spacewalk together. But why did it take so long? And what prevented it happen? Well, it was gender-based design. First of all, there weren't that many women for a long time in the astronaut corps. That's, you know, structural racism or structural sexism. And then the issue came up of, well, the suits are actually designed for men, and they were making smalls for women, and they decided they didn't have any money, so they're going to cut the small suits. So here was this structural issue that prevented people from showing that they could get the job done, and that is really tough.
Yeah, because we need, the best teams are diverse teams. And so you need to shift, you need to notice, use design thinking, nothing about us without us, design with people, figure out what's going on. And you know, that they cut the small and large suit because they're extra large, sorry, because there was budget issues, and then they immediately replaced the extra large because these guys got to go. You know, it's just this default that one group is the primary group and everybody else is other. And so the personal experiences I had, I didn't face extraordinary, like deliberate, like in your face sexism. Some of it was small, like when I decided to go to engineering school, my grandfather, who's an extraordinary engineer, built you know, Indiana highways and Pennsylvania turnpikes and lots of, was part of the steel teams in Pennsylvania. He said to my mom, why would she want to do that? You know, he couldn't see his granddaughter. But then once I went, he was like, my granddaughter, you know, so people can get there, and he did. Right. But I think more with my experience, it's death by 1,000 cuts, and it's very personally directed. So you're always doing something wrong. Your idea is not quite right. And so you're always being othered. This is important, and your idea is not. And so it's like constantly on you. And so this whole group of people kind of have their confidence broken. And it's interesting because in 1848, when they met at Seneca Falls, and they ratified the Declarations of Sentiments, which was this first sort of very comprehensive women's equality document. It's not perfect, it has some issues, but the last couple are all about this inclusion in the economy. It has equal pay, it has taking all of education, in this case it's the tech education is biased, but they said he has sought to destroy her confidence and get her to lead a dependent and abject life. 1848, confidence. So it wasn't an individual, but it's a systemic confidence destruction from media images, 15-1, boy programmers to girl programmers in family TV. So it just tells you don't belong, you don't belong. Right. And then your idea doesn't belong, so we don't want to apply to tech to other topics. Right. All the nonprofits in this town, most of them don't have a CTO or a chief data scientist. Like, was tech not useful for everything? But we got to help them and do that.
You know, I just say, you know, we're out of time on this one, but I feel like each one of these channels done today, we should do a day on. And I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time with Megan and with Ellen in the past as they tell their stories. I want to thank you both for continuing to tell your stories so often. I think they're so important. I'll share one little tidbit with Ellen. We first met down at a Georgia Tech related event, and we were talking about going to Mars and the Mars rover called Curiosity, and Curiosity's pronoun is a she. And you remember that? That was a fun thing. But thank you so much. I look forward to you getting us to Mars and running the Air and Space Museum. Megan, thank you so much. Megan Smith, former Chief Technology Officer of the Obama White House and CEO of Shift7, and Ellen Stofan, keep forgetting her, Director of the National Air and Space Museum, but, you know, chief cool person in NASA. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.